Was Pierre Curie truly a genius in his own right, or merely a quiet shadow standing beside the brilliance of Marie Curie? This question has echoed through the corridors of science for more than a century. To the general public, the name Curie conjures almost exclusively the image of Marie Curie, the double Nobel laureate, the first woman professor at the Sorbonne, and the eternal symbol of perseverance in science. Her story, one of triumph over adversity, of discovery, of sacrifice, has been told and retold, immortalized in books, films, and museums. And yet, beside her, there was Pierre Curie, her husband, her collaborator, her intellectual equal. His life was shorter, his fame dimmer, his memory often eclipsed. But was Pierre merely the supportive husband, the assistant, the secondary figure in the great Curie drama? Or was he, in fact, the quiet architect whose insights, inventions, and principles shaped not only Marie's work, but the very foundations of modern physics? The truth is more complex than the simplified tales history often tells. Pierre Curie was not just Marie's partner, he was a pioneer in his own right. His work on crystallography, piezoelectricity, magnetism, and radioactivity transformed entire fields. He coined principles that physicists still rely on. He foresaw both the promise and the peril of atomic science decades before the world fully understood it. And yet, his story is one of paradox, brilliant but humble, recognized yet often forgotten, fulfilled in discovery but cut short by tragedy. To understand Pierre Curie, we must look beyond the shadow of Marie, beyond the simplified textbooks, and into the details of his life. His childhood in Paris, his quiet brilliance as a student, his partnership with his brother Jacques, his groundbreaking scientific work, his fateful union with Marie, his rise to Nobel laureate, and his sudden death beneath the wheels of a carriage on a rainy day in 1906. This is not just a story of science, it is a story of love, sacrifice, humility, and the eternal tension between recognition and obscurity. Pierre Curie's life invites us to ask, what does it mean to be remembered? What does it mean to live for truth, even if history forgets your name? Over the following chapters, we will follow Pierre Curie's journey step by step from his early years in a modest Parisian household raised by a father who valued science and education, through his university training at the Sorbonne, where his unusual mind quickly stood out, into his collaboration with Jacques Curie, leading to the discovery of piezoelectricity, his groundbreaking research on magnetism, which revealed laws and constants that still carry his name, his meeting with Marie Sklodowska, a partnership of both love and intellect, the joint discovery of polonium and radium, which shook the foundations of science, his Nobel Prize, reluctantly accepted, with warnings about the dangers of radioactivity, his tragic death, leaving Marie to carry their torch alone, and finally, the reflections on his legacy and lessons for future generations. We will not only examine his discoveries, but also the man himself, his character, his simplicity, his quiet philosophy of science, his devotion to truth, and the cost of his choices. Paris, May 1859. The city was buzzing with change. Emperor Napoleon III was reshaping its streets under the architect Haussmann, carving wide boulevards through medieval alleys. Science was rising as the crown jewel of progress. Steam engines, powered trains, factories multiplied, and electricity was beginning to intrigue inventors. Amidst this whirlwind of modernity, in a modest home on the Rue Cuvier near the Jardin des Plantes, a boy was born who would one day change how humanity understood matter itself. His name was Pierre Curie. And so our story begins not with fame, not with glory, but with a child whose quiet eyes already seemed to look beyond the surface of the world toward its hidden laws. When Pierre Curie was born on May 15, 1859, Paris was not only the capital of France, but also a symbol of modern transformation. Emperor Napoleon III and his urban planner, Baron Haussmann, were in the midst of reshaping the city. Narrow, medieval streets were being demolished and replaced with grand boulevards, wide avenues, and monumental buildings. Gas lamps were illuminating the night, railroads were carrying people farther and faster, and a new sense of progress permeated society. But this same Paris also carried contrasts: grandeur and poverty, glittering theaters and struggling neighborhoods, imperial confidence and political unrest. Into this world of contradiction entered Pierre Curie, a child of modest means but with extraordinary potential. Pierre's family was not wealthy, but they were educated and deeply engaged in intellectual pursuits. His father, Dr. Eugène Curie, was a physician with liberal political leanings. He believed in progress through education and science, and he passed this conviction on to his children. Eugène was known for his independence of thought, his skepticism toward dogma, and his sympathy for the underprivileged. His mother, Sophie Claire de Pouilly, came from a family of modest artisans. She was a strong, disciplined woman, and she instilled in Pierre the values of simplicity, honesty, and perseverance. The Curies were not rich, but they valued knowledge above possessions. Books were treasured in their household. Discussions of medicine, philosophy, and politics often filled the dinner table. From the beginning, Pierre grew up in an atmosphere that nurtured curiosity and respect for science. Pierre was the youngest of the family's children, and from an early age he displayed traits that marked him as unusual. While other children might play noisily in the streets, Pierre preferred quiet observation. Family members recalled how he could spend long stretches of time staring at crystals, rocks, or flames in the fireplace, seemingly mesmerized. He would ask questions that adults found startling for his age, questions about why the sky was blue, why metal shone differently from wood, why magnets could attract without touching. At just 10 years old, Pierre built a crude pendulum device to study motion. Though it was little more than a weight on a string, he treated it as an instrument of discovery, recording how its swing slowed over time. His fascination was not with toys, but with phenomena. Despite his bright mind, Pierre was a frail child. He suffered from recurring illnesses, often leaving him confined indoors. Where other boys might have grown strong in the open fields, Pierre grew thoughtful in his room, surrounded by books and improvised experiments. Yet this frailty also shaped his personality. It made him serious beyond his years, more contemplative than playful. He learned to value the life of the mind, since his body often betrayed him. His introversion, later mistaken for coldness, had its roots in these childhood struggles. Unlike many children of his age who attended public schools, Pierre was largely educated at home in his early years, thanks to his father. Eugène Curie believed that rigid schooling often crushed a child's natural curiosity. Instead, he taught Pierre directly in mathematics, reading, and natural philosophy. This approach gave Pierre two advantages. He learned at his own pace, moving quickly through subjects that interested him. He developed a spirit of independence, questioning rather than merely memorizing. By the age of 14, Pierre's knowledge of mathematics was already at a level that surprised tutors. He could solve complex problems instinctively, not by rote, but by reasoning through them with unusual clarity. Pierre's formative years coincided with political turmoil in France. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871 erupted when he was just 11 years old. France's defeat brought humiliation, and Paris itself was besieged. In 1871, the city witnessed the bloody uprising of the Paris Commune, followed by brutal repression. Streets that Pierre might have walked as a boy became battlegrounds. He saw firsthand the fragility of governments and the violence of politics. For Pierre, this was an early lesson. Human institutions can collapse, but scientific truth endures. Where politics shifted like sand, the laws of nature remained constant. Even as a teenager, Pierre's personality was becoming clear. He was shy and introverted, uncomfortable in large groups. He had little patience for superficial talk, preferring deep, thoughtful discussions. He valued precision and honesty above charm or social skill. Some who met him thought him aloof. Others found him quietly kind. But all agreed that when he spoke about science, his eyes lit up with intensity. By the mid-1872, Pierre's talent was undeniable. His father and teachers recognized that he had surpassed the usual curriculum. At 16 years old, unusually young for his era, he was ready for university-level study. In 1875, Pierre Curie enrolled at the Faculty of Sciences at the Sorbonne in Paris. It was there that his childhood curiosity would mature into rigorous scientific inquiry, setting him on the path to discovery. Pierre Curie's childhood was not one of wealth, privilege, or ease. It was shaped by illness, modesty, and an inner hunger to understand the natural world. His home education gave him independence of thought. The political storms of Paris taught him skepticism toward human pride. His quiet hours with crystals, magnets, and pendulums nurtured the habits of a scientist long before he entered a laboratory. By the time he walked through the gates of the Sorbonne at 16, he was not just a boy seeking education, he was already a mind seeking truth. In 1875, at just 16 years old, Pierre Curie entered the Faculty of Sciences at the Sorbonne in Paris. Most of his fellow students were several years older, and the university environment was intimidating grand lecture halls, stern professors, and a bustling city full of ambition. Pierre, shy and reserved, stood out for his youth, his modest clothing, and his quiet demeanor. He was not the kind of student who sought attention. But in classrooms filled with eager minds, his brilliance soon became impossible to ignore. At the Sorbonne, Pierre encountered some of the greatest scientific minds of his time, among them Gabriel Lippmann, who later won the Nobel Prize for his work in color photography, Charles Friedel, a renowned chemist, Paul Schutzenberger, a specialist in chemistry who emphasized precision in measurement. From these teachers, Pierre absorbed both mathematical rigor and experimental discipline. Yet even in this environment, he was unusual. He grasped abstract concepts with ease, often going beyond the lecture to explore their implications. Pierre's classmates often noticed how he behaved differently from others. He rarely spoke in class, but when he did, his answers were startlingly clear. He disliked rote memorization. Instead, he preferred to rederive results on his own, testing whether they truly made sense. He spent long hours alone in the library, poring over works in physics and mathematics. Despite his brilliance, Pierre struggled with exams. His introversion made him uncomfortable under pressure, and his disdain for rote learning sometimes worked against him. But in practical laboratory work he shone. His patience, precision, and inventiveness earned admiration from professors. Even as a student, Pierre was fascinated by physical phenomena that seemed invisible but fundamental. He asked questions about why some materials responded to forces while others did not, how hidden structures like crystal lattices might dictate physical behavior, whether there were universal laws connecting energy, force, and matter. He was already thinking not as a student memorizing facts, but as a scientist searching for hidden symmetries. During these years, Pierre's closest collaborator was his older brother, Jacques Curie. Though Jacques was already pursuing his own career, the two spent countless hours together, discussing experiments and designing instruments. Their bond was unusual. Few brothers collaborated so closely in science. Jacques provided steadiness and practical skill, while Pierre brought mathematical vision and conceptual daring. In their modest home laboratory, they began experimenting with crystals, bending them, heating them, applying forces, and observing their responses. It was a quiet beginning, but it would lead to a major discovery. Life as a student was not easy for Pierre. His family's finances were limited, and he lived with great simplicity. His clothes were plain, his meals often meager. He walked rather than took carriages, and he avoided social entertainments that many students enjoyed. But Pierre was indifferent to these hardships. For him, the pursuit of knowledge was more valuable than comfort. He could spend hours immersed in experiments, forgetting food and time. By 1878, professors at the Sorbonne were already noting Pierre's unusual gifts. He was not a typical prodigy who dazzled with flamboyant answers. Instead, he impressed with his quiet depth. He solved problems in ways that showed not just knowledge but originality. One professor remarked that Pierre thinks as though the problem itself had been waiting for him to see it. In 1880, Pierre completed his degree in physics, ranking near the top of his class. He was only 21 years old. His next step would not be to chase wealth or prestige, but to continue working with Jacques in pursuit of a phenomenon that would soon capture the world's attention: piezoelectricity. Pierre Curie's years at the Sorbonne revealed his character as much as his intellect. He was shy, modest, and indifferent to appearances. Yet beneath that quiet exterior lay a mind of extraordinary clarity, already seeking the hidden symmetries of nature. As he left the Sorbonne, Pierre was no longer just a promising student. He was a scientist in formation, ready to make his first great discovery. In 1880, having completed his degree at the Sorbonne, Pierre Curie was only 21 years old. He was shy, modest, and not yet widely known, but his intellectual gifts were already extraordinary. At this point, he chose a path not of prestige or wealth, but of curiosity. He returned to the modest family apartment where his older brother, Jacques Curie, was working. Together, the Curie brothers decided to investigate a subject few others considered glamorous: crystals. To many, crystals were simply beautiful objects admired by jewelers and collectors, but of little interest to physicists. Yet, to Pierre and Jacques, they were windows into the hidden order of matter. Crystals are unique because their atoms are arranged in repeating, symmetrical patterns. The brothers believed that such perfect order must produce measurable physical effects. If matter had a geometry at its core, then perhaps energy could flow through it in unexpected ways. It was an unfashionable field, overlooked by many scientists. But precisely because of this, the Curies were free to explore it without pressure or interference. The Curies did not have access to wealthy laboratories or expensive instruments. Instead, they relied on their own ingenuity. In their modest workspace, they built delicate apparatuses with their own hands. Pierre, in particular, showed remarkable skill in designing instruments of precision. He created balances so sensitive that they could detect the weight of a hair and electrometers capable of registering charges too faint for ordinary devices. Jacques, steady and practical, complemented Pierre's theoretical imagination. Their laboratory was cluttered, improvised, sometimes uncomfortable, but in that humble setting, they would change the course of science. In 1880, while pressing crystals of quartz, rochelle, salt, and tourmaline, the Curie brothers observed something extraordinary. When a crystal was subjected to mechanical stress, pressure, or bending, an electrical charge appeared on its surface. Conversely, when an electrical field was applied, the crystal itself deformed slightly, changing shape in response. This was the birth of piezoelectricity, from the Greek piezein, meaning to press. It was as though the crystals themselves could act as a bridge between the mechanical world of pressure and the electrical world of charge. Skeptics at first doubted the phenomenon. Could these tiny charges be real, or were they artifacts of flawed instruments? To prove it, the Curies conducted painstaking measurements, repeating the experiments again and again under varied conditions. Their results were consistent. The effect was real, measurable, and reproducible. The scientific community began to take notice. While not everyone understood the significance, there was no denying the rigor of the Curies' work. Out of these studies emerged one of Pierre's most profound ideas. Curie's principle. He reasoned that, when certain causes produce certain effects, the symmetry of the causes must be found in the effects. In other words, the geometry of a crystal dictated the kind of physical effects it could exhibit. If a crystal was symmetrical in certain directions, then electrical or mechanical responses would follow the same pattern. This principle, though abstract, became foundational. It influenced not only crystallography, but later fields such as particle physics and relativity. At the time, the discovery was regarded as a curiosity. Interesting, yes, but practical? Few could imagine how it might be useful, and yet piezoelectricity would go on to shape the modern world. In sonar systems, allowing detection of submarines; in medical ultrasound, revealing the hidden images inside the body; in quartz watches, keeping time with extraordinary precision; in microphones, lighters, sensors, and countless other technologies. The Curies could not have foreseen these applications, but they knew they had uncovered a profound link between forces. Despite their achievement, the brothers remained modest and financially constrained. Recognition was slow, and there were no great rewards. They continued to live simply, devoting their energy to further experiments. Pierre, in particular, seemed indifferent to fame. He often appeared absent-minded in daily life, as though his thoughts were always with his instruments and equations. His modest apartment, his plain clothing, and his quiet manner contrasted sharply with the magnitude of his discoveries. By 1883, however, word of the Curie brothers' work was spreading in academic circles. They were no longer obscure. Their discovery of piezoelectricity had proven their skill, their originality, and their precision. For Pierre, this was the beginning of recognition, though he remained as humble as ever. And yet, this was only the start. His restless mind was already turning toward another invisible force, one that would occupy him for more than a decade: magnetism. The discovery of piezoelectricity was Pierre Curie's first great triumph. It showed his gift for precision, his ability to see connections others missed, and his philosophical belief in symmetry. Though underappreciated at first, this work would echo through the 20th century in technologies unimaginable to Pierre and Jacques. But Pierre was not a man to rest on one discovery. As the 1882nd unfolded, he would plunge into the mysteries of magnetism, seeking laws as deep and universal as those he had glimpsed in crystals. By the early 1882nd, Pierre Curie had already achieved something remarkable with his brother Jacques, the discovery of piezoelectricity. It was an elegant revelation, bridging mechanics and electricity, yet Pierre's restless mind pushed him further. He was convinced that nature held universal laws, hidden beneath phenomena that seemed at first glance unconnected. He turned his gaze toward a force as old as the compass and as mysterious as lightning: magnetism. Magnetism had intrigued thinkers for centuries. Ancient Chinese navigators used lodestones to guide ships. In the 17th century, William Gilbert had written his groundbreaking De Magnet, describing Earth itself as a giant magnet. In the 19th century, Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell had revealed the deep links between electricity and magnetism. But many questions remained. Why were some materials magnetic while others were not? Why did temperature seem to affect magnetism? Could there be hidden patterns connecting heat, energy, and magnetic force? Pierre Curie decided to pursue these mysteries with the same precision and patience that had characterized his work on crystals. To study magnetism, Pierre needed instruments more sensitive than any that existed, so he built his own. His most famous invention of this period was the Curie balance, a delicate apparatus capable of measuring the tiniest magnetic forces. The balance consisted of a fine beam with a sample suspended, placed in a carefully controlled magnetic field. By measuring how much the field influenced the balance, Pierre could detect changes so small they were invisible to other scientists. The Curie balance was not just a tool, It was a work of genius in experimental design, a symbol of Pierre's belief that progress required not only ideas, but also instruments of exquisite sensitivity. Through painstaking experiments with his balance, Pierre discovered something remarkable. He found that the magnetic susceptibility, the degree to which a material could be magnetized, of paramagnetic substances, decreased predictably as temperature increased. From this he formulated the Curie law. The magnetization of a paramagnetic material is inversely proportional to its absolute temperature. In simple terms, the hotter a paramagnetic material becomes, the weaker its magnetism. This was a profound breakthrough, uniting the fields of magnetism and thermodynamics. It showed that magnetism was not an isolated property, but deeply connected to heat and energy. Even more significant was Pierre's identification of what became known as the Curie point, Curie temperature. He discovered that ferromagnetic materials, like iron, cobalt, and nickel, which can retain permanent magnetism, suddenly lose this property at a critical temperature. Above this point, they behave like paramagnets, magnetized only in the presence of an external field. This finding revolutionized the understanding of magnetism. It suggested that magnetism was not an immutable property but a state of matter, subject to transformation by heat. Today, the Curie point remains a cornerstone of physics, materials, science, and geology, used, for example, to study the history of Earth's magnetic field through rocks. While conducting these experiments, Pierre also developed his broader principle of symmetry. He argued that the symmetry of causes must be found in the effects, an elegant concept that guided not only crystallography but also magnetism. This principle helped him predict what physical effects were possible or impossible in certain materials, based purely on their geometric symmetry. It was both philosophical and practical, showing Pierre's rare ability to combine mathematics, experiment, and abstract reasoning. By the early 1892, Pierre Curie was respected within the scientific community. His work on magnetism was published in leading journals, and his doctoral thesis, completed in 1895, established him as a pioneer. Yet he remained as modest as ever. He disliked fame, avoided public appearances, and cared little for honors. His joy was in the experiment itself, not in recognition. Colleagues admired him, but sometimes found him distant, absorbed in his thoughts. Students recalled his quiet lectures, spoken without flourish, but filled with clarity. By 1894, Pierre had built a reputation as one of France's most meticulous physicists. He had invented instruments of precision, formulated laws of magnetism still taught today, developed a principle of symmetry influencing physics for decades to come. But in his personal life, he remained solitary. At 35, he was unmarried, living simply and devoting nearly all his energy to science. Friends worried he might remain forever alone, his life devoted only to equations and apparatus. That same year, however, destiny intervened. A brilliant young woman from Poland, determined to pursue science against all odds, arrived in Paris. Her name was Maria Sklodowska. Their meeting would change Pierre Curie's life and the history of science forever. The years from 1883 to 1894 were Pierre Curie's proving ground. He had moved from the relative obscurity of a student to the status of a respected physicist. His discoveries in magnetism, crowned by the Curie law and Curie point, established his name in the annals of physics. And yet, this was only the prelude. The most important chapter of his life, his partnership with Marie, was about to begin. By 1894, Pierre Curie was 35 years old. He had spent nearly 2 decades immersed in research, first in crystallography with his brother Jacques, then in magnetism, where he discovered laws that bore his name. He had achieved respect among scientists, but outside academic circles, he was little known. His life was one of austere simplicity. He dressed plainly, avoided social gatherings, and cared little for wealth or recognition. His modest salary as a physics instructor at the École Municipale de Physique et de Chimie barely covered his needs, but he was content. Science was his refuge, his joy, and his destiny. Yet beneath his calm exterior, Pierre's friends sensed a void. He had no companion, no partner to share his life. At 35, he seemed destined for solitude. Meanwhile, far from Paris, a young woman was pursuing her own destiny. Maria Sklodowska, born in Warsaw in 1867, grew up under the shadow of Russian rule. Her childhood was marked by loss, the deaths of her mother and sister, and by the harsh restrictions placed on Polish culture and education. But Maria was fiercely determined. Denied access to higher education in her homeland, she joined an underground network of intellectuals, secretly studying science. She dreamed of one day contributing to her country's independence through knowledge. In 1891, at the age of 24, Maria moved to Paris, enrolling at the Sorbonne. She adopted the French version of her name, Marie, and immersed herself in study. Despite poverty and loneliness, she excelled. In 1893, she earned her degree in physics, ranking first in her class. A year later, she obtained a degree in mathematics. By 1894, Marie was searching for laboratory space to continue her research. It was a Polish colleague, Professor Józef Wierusz-Kowalski, who introduced her to Pierre Curie. Pierre, he said, was a kind, brilliant physicist who might be able to help. The meeting was arranged in the summer of 1894. Pierre, awkward and shy, was immediately struck by Marie's determination and quiet strength. Marie, cautious and reserved, was impressed by Pierre's gentleness and sincerity. This was no love at first sight, no dramatic romance. It was something subtler and perhaps stronger, mutual recognition. Each sensed in the other a soul devoted to science. Their relationship deepened through long conversations, not about trivialities, but about physics, mathematics, and the mysteries of nature. They walked the streets of Paris discussing crystals, magnetism, and electricity. They shared dreams. Marie spoke of her longing to serve Poland, Pierre, of his desire to uncover the hidden symmetries of the universe. For Marie, Pierre was unlike any man she had met. He treated her as an equal, listening with respect, never condescending. For Pierre, Marie was a revelation, a woman whose mind matched his own intensity. As their bond grew, they exchanged letters. Pierre's words were gentle, intellectual, almost philosophical. In one letter he wrote, "It would be a fine thing to pass through life together, hypnotized in our dreams, your dream for your country, our dream for humanity, our dream for science." Pierre proposed marriage. At first, Marie hesitated. She still felt duty-bound to return to Poland, where she hoped to build a scientific career. But Pierre's devotion was absolute. He told her that if she returned to Poland, he would follow her, abandoning his own work in France to be with her. This act of selflessness moved Marie deeply. On the 26th of July, 1895, Pierre Curie and Marie Sklodowska were married in a simple civil ceremony. There was no pomp, no grand celebration. Marie wore a dark blue dress practical enough to serve later as laboratory clothing. Their honeymoon was spent cycling through the French countryside, exploring villages and landscapes with the curiosity of two children of science. Friends observed that their union was less about romance in the conventional sense and more about a profound partnership of minds and hearts. Their married life was as modest as their wedding. They lived in a small apartment, cluttered with books, notebooks, and instruments. Their evenings were filled with scientific discussions, calculations, and dreams of discovery. For Pierre, who had lived so long in solitude, Marie brought companionship, warmth, and inspiration. For Marie, who had struggled against barriers and prejudice, Pierre brought unwavering respect and support. They were, in every sense, partners. At the time of their marriage, neither could have imagined the discoveries awaiting them. Within 3 years, they would coin the word radioactivity, isolate new elements, and shake the foundations of physics and chemistry. But in 1895, they were simply two scientists, united by love and by a common devotion to truth. The meeting of Pierre Curie and Marie Sklodowska was not an accident. It was destiny. Two solitary lives converged, and in their union they created not just a family, but a revolution in science. Pierre had found the partner he never expected, and Marie had found the equal she had always sought. Together, they would write one of the greatest chapters in the history of human knowledge. Pierre and Marie were married on the 26th of July, 1895. Unlike the grand marriages of Parisian society, their ceremony was a modest civil affair. There were no jewels, no fine gowns, no wealthy gifts. Marie wore a dark blue dress practical enough to serve later as laboratory clothing, and their honeymoon consisted of cycling through the French countryside. It was the perfect reflection of their characters: simplicity, practicality, and curiosity. They settled into a small apartment in Paris, sparsely furnished but filled with books, notebooks, and scientific instruments. For them, happiness did not lie in luxury, but in shared purpose. Daily life for the Curies was humble but harmonious. They lived frugally on Pierre's modest salary as a physics instructor. Marie, still adjusting to life in France, sometimes struggled with homesickness for Poland, but Pierre's kindness and quiet devotion softened the burden. Their evenings were often spent not in social gatherings but at their desks, side by side, reading scientific journals, scribbling calculations, or sketching apparatus. Theirs was a marriage where science was the common language of love. From the beginning, Pierre treated Marie not as an assistant or pupil, but as an equal collaborator. He listened to her ideas with respect, debated her hypotheses seriously, and encouraged her ambitions. Marie, in turn, admired Pierre's patience and precision. His skill in designing sensitive instruments, balances, electrometers, and measurement devices complemented her determination and meticulous work ethic. Together, they began to dream of pursuing research projects as partners. Their laboratory space, however, was far from ideal. At the École Municipale de Physique et de Chimie, Pierre was given only a drafty wooden shed attached to the school. The shed was poorly ventilated, freezing in winter and stifling in summer. The roof leaked when it rained, and the floor was often damp. But to Pierre and Marie, this shed was a sanctuary. Surrounded by crude equipment, they worked with quiet determination, transforming it into a place where science advanced at a pace unmatched by grander institutions. In November 1895, a few months after their marriage, German physicist Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen discovered X-rays. His images of bones inside living hands and objects inside sealed boxes stunned the world. The Curies followed the reports with fascination. If invisible rays could pass through flesh and metal, what other hidden forces might exist within matter? The discovery deepened their interest in phenomena beyond the reach of human senses. For Pierre, it was another reminder that nature held secrets waiting to be uncovered. For Marie, it suggested a bold new research path. During these years, Marie was still considering topics for her doctoral thesis. Influenced by Henri Becquerel's discovery in 1896, soon after this period, that uranium emitted mysterious rays, she would choose to study these emissions. Pierre, initially focused on his work in magnetism, would soon be drawn fully into her research. Their partnership was about to become a fusion of intellects, setting them on a path toward immortality in science. Yet life for the Curies in these early married years was not all work. They also enjoyed simple pleasures, cycling trips together through the countryside, walks along the Seine, discussing not just science but philosophy, politics, and literature, visits to friends who admired their unusual, dedicated lifestyle. Marie later wrote that these years were among the happiest of her life. They had little money, little comfort, but they had each other, and the shared dream of discovery. Between 1895 and 1897, Pierre and Marie Curie forged a partnership unlike any other. Their marriage was not built on wealth or status, but on equality, respect, and shared devotion to truth. Together, in their shabby laboratory, they prepared to embark on one of the greatest scientific journeys of all time, the exploration of radioactivity. By the late 1892, physics was entering a golden age. In 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen had discovered X-rays, astonishing the world with images of bones inside flesh. In early 1896, Henri Becquerel reported another strange phenomenon. Certain uranium salts emitted invisible rays that could fog photographic plates even in darkness. To many scientists, these discoveries were curiosities, intriguing, but peripheral. To Pierre and Marie Curie, they were invitations. In 1897, Marie Curie was searching for a topic for her doctoral thesis. She could have chosen a safe subject in crystallography or magnetism. Instead, she decided to investigate the mysterious rays discovered by Becquerel. It was a bold choice. The subject was little understood, the instruments crude, the results uncertain. But Marie was drawn to the unknown. She began measuring the faint currents produced when uranium salts emitted their rays. For this, she used a sensitive electrometer designed by Pierre and Jacques Curie years earlier. The instrument was so precise that it allowed her to detect tiny variations invisible to others. At first, Pierre continued his own research in magnetism. But as Marie's results grew more intriguing, he became increasingly involved. Soon, he abandoned his work to join hers. Together, they began systematically testing elements and minerals to see if they emitted rays like uranium. To their astonishment, they found that some substances were far more active than uranium itself. As they explored these mysterious emissions, the Curies realized they were dealing with a phenomenon entirely new. The rays seemed to come from the very atoms of the substance, not from chemical reactions or external forces. In 1898, Marie coined the term radioactivity to describe this property, the spontaneous emission of energy from matter itself. It was a revolutionary idea. For centuries, atoms had been thought indivisible, stable, the ultimate building blocks of matter. The Curie's research suggested otherwise. Atoms were not unchanging, but dynamic, overflowing with hidden energy. The work was grueling. Their laboratory was a drafty wooden shed attached to Pierre's school. It was damp, poorly ventilated, and freezing in winter. The roof leaked and the floor was uneven. The Curies stirred cauldrons of heavy ore, processed powders, and measured faint currents for hours on end. Their hands became rough and blistered. They inhaled dust, carried burns on their skin, and felt constant fatigue. And yet, they never complained. For them, the joy of discovery outweighed every discomfort. The way they worked together astonished observers. Marie would labor tirelessly at chemical separations, refining ores into smaller and smaller fractions. Pierre, with his instruments, would measure the intensity of their emissions. They checked and rechecked each other's results. They spoke little. As they worked, words were unnecessary. Their communication was seamless, built on trust and shared vision. In those long days, side by side in the shed, they were not just husband and wife, they were co-discoverers. By mid-1898, the Curies had gathered enough evidence to suggest that two new elements were hidden within the uranium ore known as pitchblende. One of these they would name polonium, after Marie's homeland of Poland. The other they would soon call radium, for its intense rays. But before those announcements, they had already achieved something extraordinary. They had opened a door into a new science. Between 1897 and 1898, Pierre and Marie Curie transformed an obscure curiosity into a field that would dominate 20th century physics. By coining the term radioactivity, they revealed a universe within the atom, a hidden reservoir of energy that would one day power both medicine and weapons of mass destruction. In their shabby shed, working with crude tools, they began a revolution, and they were only just beginning. By the summer of 1898, Pierre and Marie Curie had gathered enough evidence to suspect that uranium ore, specifically pitchblende, contained substances far more radioactive than uranium itself. Their instruments showed that certain fractions of the ore produced rays hundreds of times stronger than those of pure uranium. This could only mean one thing: unknown elements were hidden inside. It was a bold claim. Elements were not discovered lightly. The periodic table was already crowded, and to propose entirely new elements required extraordinary proof. But the Curies were determined. On the 18th of July, 1898, the Curies announced their first discovery, a new element which they named polonium. Marie chose the name in honor of her homeland, Poland, which at the time did not exist as an independent nation, being partitioned between Russia, Austria, and Germany. It was both a scientific tribute and a political statement, a way of inscribing her country onto the periodic table of the world. Polonium was present in vanishingly small quantities. The Curies could not isolate it completely at the time, but their measurements proved its existence. It was an extraordinary moment. A modest couple in a shabby shed had identified a new element, reshaping chemistry itself. Only a few months later, in December 1898, the Curies announced the discovery of another, even more remarkable element, radium. This element emitted rays so powerful they seemed almost supernatural. Unlike uranium or polonium, radium's emissions were intense enough to fog photographic plates through thick coverings, to burn skin, and to produce a faint, eerie glow in the dark. Radium seemed alive, endlessly emitting energy, defying the laws of conservation as they were then understood. It was not just a new element, it was a new force of nature. But discovering radium was only the beginning. To prove its existence beyond doubt, the Curies had to isolate it from tons of raw ore. They obtained several tons of pitchblende from a factory in Bohemia, which considered the waste material nearly worthless. In their drafty shed, the Curies set about processing it, crushing it, dissolving it in acid, boiling it, precipitating fractions, and testing each one for radioactivity. It was exhausting, dangerous work. The air was filled with toxic fumes, the floors littered with heavy cauldrons of boiling chemicals. Marie stirred vats with iron rods taller than herself. Pierre measured emissions late into the night, his hands scarred and burned. They worked for years, producing only milligrams of radium from tons of ore, but the glow of their samples, faint, bluish, ghostly, kept them going. News of radium spread quickly. Newspapers sensationalized it as a miracle element. People marveled at its glow, imagining magical cures or limitless energy. Scientists were intrigued but cautious. Some doubted whether radium was truly a new element. Others speculated about its potential in medicine, particularly in treating tumors. For the Curies, the attention was both gratifying and distracting. They had little interest in fame. They refused to patent their methods, believing that scientific discoveries should belong to humanity, not individuals. This idealism would later leave them financially strained, even as industries profited from radium. The long hours, the toxic chemicals, and the constant exposure to radiation began to take a toll. Both Pierre and Marie suffered from fatigue, burns, and unexplained illnesses. Their hands were often sore and blistered. They had no idea of the long-term dangers of radiation, but neither considered stopping. The pursuit of truth, they believed, was worth any cost. The discovery of polonium and radium cemented the Curies as one of the greatest scientific partnerships in history. They had opened the door to a new science, radioactivity, discovered not one but two new elements, challenged the long-standing belief that atoms were indivisible and immutable. For Pierre, These years were the most fulfilling of his life. He had found not only love, but also collaboration of the deepest kind. For Marie, the discoveries marked the beginning of her path to becoming the most celebrated woman in science. By 1900, Pierre and Marie Curie stood at the forefront of a scientific revolution. In a shed that most would have dismissed as unfit for serious work, they had discovered polonium and radium, forever changing our understanding of matter. Yet, despite their triumph, they remained humble, modest, and financially insecure. They sought not wealth or glory, but knowledge. The world was beginning to notice, and soon recognition, honors, and fame would descend upon them. By the dawn of the 20th century, Pierre and Marie Curie had isolated small but undeniable samples of radium salts. These fragments, stored in tiny glass vials, emitted a faint bluish glow in the dark. Visitors to the Curie laboratory were astonished. In a world still lit largely by gas, lamps, and candles, the idea of a substance that glowed of its own accord seemed magical. Scientists had seen phosphorescence and luminescence before, but radium was different. It never faded, never needed charging by light. It glowed endlessly, as if holding an inner fire. The Curies themselves marveled at it. On nights when their work left them exhausted, they sometimes paused in the darkness just to admire the mysterious shimmer of their radium samples. Word spread quickly through the scientific community and then into the newspaper. Radium became a sensation, described as a miracle element. Journalists speculated wildly. Could it be the key to eternal light? Might it cure disease? Could it reveal new sources of limitless energy? Exhibitions were organized where the public could glimpse the glow of radium. Popular magazines carried illustrations of vials shining like tiny stars. Radium entered not only laboratories, but also the imagination of a world hungry for wonder. Among the earliest and most serious applications of radium was in medicine. Doctors observed that radium's rays could burn human skin, a dangerous effect, but one that hinted at possible benefits. If radium could destroy healthy tissue, perhaps it could also destroy tumors. Physicians began cautiously experimenting with radium therapy. In some cases, cancers shrank, and patients experienced temporary relief. The idea of radiotherapy was born a field that would save countless lives in the decades to come. Pierre Curie watched the growing enthusiasm for radium with ambivalence. On one hand, he was proud that their discovery might help humanity. On the other, he was uneasy about the frenzy it provoked. He feared that the public saw radium as a toy or a wonder, rather than a subject of careful scientific study. He worried, too, about its dangers. Long before most scientists considered radiation harmful, Pierre suspected that radium could cause serious injury. Radium could be very dangerous in criminal hands, and it is to be feared that it might one day serve to make men suffer. His words, prophetic and haunting, foreshadowed the atomic age that would come decades later. Despite the world's fascination with radium, the Curies themselves remained poor. They refused to patent their methods of isolating radium, insisting that knowledge should belong to all. As a result, they saw no profit, even as industries and physicians began using their discoveries commercially. Their laboratory conditions remained harsh. They still worked in the shabby shed, their hands blistered, their health weakened. Fame brought them little material relief. By 1902, Pierre and Marie Curie were famous names in the scientific world. Yet they lived like obscure researchers, walking the streets of Paris unnoticed, dining modestly, and avoiding social events. Their fame was scientific, not social. They had no fortune, no lavish lifestyle, no political power, but they had something greater, the knowledge that their work had revealed an entirely new dimension of nature. As the world entered the 20th century, the Curie's discoveries were impossible to ignore. Scientific societies debated their significance. Universities honored them. And in Sweden, the Royal Academy of Sciences began to consider whether the Curies and Henri Becquerel should be honored with the Nobel Prize in Physics. Pierre and Marie, still immersed in their daily grind of experiments, scarcely noticed. They were too busy with their radium, too absorbed in their quest for truth, to think of prizes, but history was preparing to crown them. Between 1900 and 1902, radium became more than a discovery. It became a symbol. It symbolized the hidden powers of the atom, the promise of science to cure disease, and the wonder of human ingenuity. For Pierre Curie, however, this period was bittersweet. He saw the beauty of radium, but also its dangers. He saw fame rising around him, but remained humble and uneasy. Soon recognition would come on a scale he could no longer avoid, the Nobel Prize. By 1903, the world had taken notice of the mysterious new science of radioactivity. Wilhelm Röntgen's discovery of X-rays had already earned him the very first Nobel Prize in Physics in 1901. Henry Becquerel's discovery of uranium rays and the Curie's subsequent work on polonium and radium had created an entirely new field of study. The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, tasked with awarding the Nobel, debated who should be honored in 1903. It was clear that Becquerel had made the initial discovery. It was also clear that Pierre Curie had contributed immensely, but Marie Curie's role was viewed with skepticism. At the time, women were rarely acknowledged in scientific institutions. Some on the Nobel Committee suggested awarding the prize only to Becquerel and Pierre. When Pierre learned of this, he was outraged. He insisted that Marie's contributions were equal to his own. It was she who had chosen the subject of uranium rays for her doctoral work. It was she who had coined the term radioactivity. She had endured endless hours of labor in their primitive shed, refining tons of ore to isolate new elements. Pierre refused to allow history to erase her. He wrote to the Academy, making clear that any recognition of him must include Marie. His insistence prevailed. The Nobel Prize in Physics for 1903 was awarded jointly to Henri Becquerel, Pierre Curie, and Marie Curie. Marie thus became the first woman in history to receive a Nobel Prize. In December 1903, the Curies traveled reluctantly to Stockholm. Neither Pierre nor Marie cared for pomp or ceremony. Pierre disliked travel, public speaking, and the limelight. Marie, modest and shy, also preferred the solitude of her laboratory. Henri Becquerel, dignified and reserved, spoke first, describing his discovery of uranium rays. Pierre then gave a lecture in which he described the properties of radium and speculated about its potential uses and dangers. In his remarks, Pierre offered a chillingly prescient warning. It is conceivable that in criminal hands, radium could be very dangerous, and one is to fear that it might one day serve for harmful purposes. This was decades before the atomic bomb. Already, Pierre glimpsed the double-edged nature of scientific discovery. The Nobel Prize transformed the Curies from obscure researchers into international celebrities. Newspapers wrote stories about their discoveries, their marriage, their modest lifestyle. Invitations poured in from universities and governments, but for Pierre, fame was a burden. He disliked interviews, hated publicity, and avoided honors. To him, science was about truth, not recognition. He often retreated into silence when confronted by journalists. Marie adapted slightly better, though she too disliked fame. She recognized its value in advancing opportunities for women in science, but she remained happiest in the laboratory. The Nobel Prize came with a monetary award, which provided some financial relief for the Curies, who had long struggled to make ends meet. But they did not indulge in luxuries. Instead, they used much of the money to support family, buy scientific equipment, and continue their research. They remained as modest as ever, walking the streets of Paris like ordinary citizens, living in a simple apartment and working in their drafty shed. Despite the honor, Pierre grew increasingly uneasy with the attention. He once confessed to a friend that he found the sudden fame exhausting. He worried that recognition distracted from the real work of science. He also worried about the implications of their discovery. Radium was already being commercialized, sometimes irresponsibly, used in patent medicines, and radium water sold to the public. Pierre feared that science was being exploited before its dangers were fully understood. The year 1903 marked both a triumph and a turning point. Pierre and Marie Curie had received the world's highest scientific honor, forcing the Nobel Committee to recognize a woman for the first time. Their names were now immortal. But for Pierre, the prize brought not joy but unease. He foresaw the misuse of radium, resented the intrusion of fame, and longed for the quiet of his laboratory. He had achieved recognition, but at a cost. After the Nobel Prize in 1903, the lives of Pierre and Marie Curie changed dramatically. Almost overnight, they were transformed from obscure researchers working in a shabby shed into scientific celebrities. Newspapers across Europe printed stories about their discoveries. Invitations arrived from academies, governments, and universities. They were asked to give lectures, attend banquets, and sit for portraits. For Pierre, this new visibility was both overwhelming and distasteful. He had never sought fame. He valued silence, solitude, and the steady rhythm of laboratory work. To be thrust into the spotlight felt like a violation of his nature. Parisian society was eager to celebrate the Curies. In a city that prided itself on culture and intellect, Pierre and Marie seemed like heroic figures, humble, hard-working, brilliant. Politicians wanted to claim their achievements as French triumphs. Journalists portrayed them as noble idealists who gave their discovery freely to humanity. The public wanted to glimpse them, hear them, almost worship them. But Pierre resisted. He often refused interviews, avoided social events, and declined honors. He told friends that he felt embarrassed by praise, as if recognition diminished the purity of science. Marie, though equally modest, adapted more easily to public life. She understood that recognition brought opportunities, funding for research, access to laboratories, and a chance to open doors for women in science. Yet she, too, preferred the laboratory to the stage. She endured ceremonies with quiet dignity, but found her true joy in working with beakers, notebooks, and calculations. Together, Pierre and Marie walked a delicate line celebrated by the world, yet inwardly yearning for anonymity. One of the most significant changes in Pierre's life came in 1904 when he was appointed professor of physics at the Sorbonne. It was the first time in history that the Sorbonne officially recognized radioactivity as a subject worthy of its own lectures. Pierre, though reluctant, accepted the position out of a sense of duty. He knew it would provide stability for his family and legitimacy for the new science he and Marie had pioneered. His lectures drew large crowds. Students, colleagues, and even members of the public came to hear the man who had discovered radium. Yet Pierre remained true to himself. His voice was quiet, his delivery modest, his explanations precise. He refused theatrics. He spoke only what he believed to be true, without exaggeration. Some found him difficult to hear. Others found him profoundly inspiring. The demands of fame took a toll on Pierre. He was frequently asked to travel and lecture abroad. Though he complied occasionally, he disliked leaving Paris, and especially disliked leaving the laboratory. The constant attention drained him. He became fatigued, both physically and emotionally. Friends noted that his face often looked pale, his body thin, his eyes weary. More troubling, both Pierre and Marie began suffering from the effects of radiation exposure, sores on their hands, fatigue that never lifted, and unexplained illnesses. At the time, the dangers of radiation were not understood. The burns and fatigue were regarded as occupational hazards, not warnings of deeper harm. Despite the honors and recognition, Pierre remained torn. On one side, he felt an obligation to represent his science, to secure its place in the academic world, and to ensure Marie received equal recognition. On the other side, He longed for the quiet obscurity in which discovery was pure, unsullied by applause. He once remarked, "One never notices what has been done. One can only see what remains to be done." For Pierre, the Nobel Prize and celebrity were distractions from the endless work still ahead. By 1904, Pierre Curie was both celebrated and burdened. He had become a professor at the Sorbonne, a Nobel laureate, a figure admired around the world, yet fame sat heavily upon him. He craved silence, not applause, truth, not honor. This tension would define the final years of his life, years of recognition, responsibility, and increasing strain. To the world, Pierre Curie was a physicist of precision, a Nobel laureate, a man of equations and experiments. But at home, behind the modest door of the Curie apartment, he revealed another side, quiet, tender, deeply devoted to his family. Those who knew him well recalled that his private life was marked not by fame or ambition, but by simplicity and love. He cared little for social conventions, but he cared deeply for Marie and their 2 daughters. On the 12th of September, 1897, Marie gave birth to their first child, Irene Curie. At the time, Marie was already immersed in her doctoral research, while Pierre was balancing teaching and experiments. Their lives were full, but the arrival of Irene brought joy and grounding. Pierre adored his daughter. Despite long hours in the laboratory, he always found time to carry her on his shoulders during walks or to sit with her in the evenings, telling her simple stories. Irene would later recall how her father's presence, though often quiet, felt like a steady source of warmth and reassurance. Life in the Curie household was a delicate balance between science and family. Marie often worked late in the laboratory, and Pierre supported her fully, sometimes taking responsibility for childcare to ensure she could continue her research. This was unusual for the time. In an era when most men saw domestic duties as women's work, Pierre embraced his role as an equal partner. He believed in Marie's brilliance as much as his own, and refused to confine her to traditional expectations. Their marriage was truly a partnership not only in science but also in raising their children. In 1904, the Curies welcomed their second daughter, Eve Curie. Unlike Irene, who would grow up to follow her parents into science, Eve's life path would be different. She later became a writer, musician, and journalist. But as a child, Eve too knew her father's quiet devotion. Though Pierre was often exhausted from research and teaching, he found joy in simple family moments, watching his daughters play, walking with them in the park, or listening as Marie read aloud. Pierre's devotion to Marie extended far beyond love. He believed deeply in her intellect and treated her as an equal, something extraordinarily rare at the time. When the Nobel Committee initially considered excluding Marie from the 1903 prize, Pierre's intervention ensured her rightful recognition. When critics doubted the ability of a woman to contribute to science, Pierre stood firmly at her side. He once wrote of her, "She has a strength of character and clarity of mind that few men can equal." Pierre's quiet but unwavering support allowed Marie to flourish, even in a world that often dismissed women. Despite their fame, the Curie family lived modestly. Their apartment was filled with books, notes, and scientific instruments, but little luxury. Marie wore practical clothes, often the same dress for both laboratory and public occasions. Pierre owned few possessions beyond his notebooks and instruments. Meals were simple, conversations thoughtful, and evenings often quiet. Fame had not altered their lifestyle. They lived not as celebrities, but as a family devoted to learning and love. Though reserved, Pierre showed his love for his daughters in countless small ways. He carried Irene on his shoulders through the streets of Paris. He built simple toys, demonstrating the principles of physics in playful ways. He encouraged curiosity, answering questions patiently and honestly. For Irene, especially, Pierre became an intellectual role model. She absorbed his love for science and later followed in his footsteps, eventually winning a Nobel Prize herself in 1935 with her husband, Frédéric Joliot. Family life, however, was not without strain. Pierre's health was deteriorating under the toll of radiation exposure and exhaustion. He often came home weak, his hands blistered, his energy low. Marie, too, suffered fatigue. And yet they endured not by hiding their struggles, but by leaning on each other. Their home, though modest, was a refuge of solidarity. In the story of Pierre Curie, it is easy to see only the scientist, the equations, the instruments, the discoveries. But he was also a husband who believed in his wife, and a father who carried his daughters on his shoulders. In the quiet moments of family life, Pierre revealed a warmth and humility that balanced the rigors of science. He was not only a man of reason, but also a man of love. His family would carry that love forward, Irene into science, Eve into literature, and Marie into her unending devotion to their shared dream. In 1904, Pierre Curie was appointed professor of physics at the Sorbonne, one of the most prestigious academic institutions in France. This was no ordinary appointment. For the first time in history, the Sorbonne officially recognized radioactivity as a legitimate subject of study. It was a triumph, not only for Pierre personally, but for the new science he and Marie had created. What had begun in a shabby shed was now acknowledged by one of Europe's great universities. Pierre's lectures were eagerly anticipated. Students, colleagues, and even curious members of the public crowded into lecture halls to hear the man who had discovered radium. Yet Pierre remained true to himself. His voice was soft, sometimes difficult to hear. His manner was modest, almost shy. He presented ideas with clarity and precision, never exaggerating or seeking to impress. Those who listened carefully were rewarded. He explained radioactivity not as a spectacle, but as a profound window into the structure of matter. His words carried weight precisely because they were simple, honest, and thoughtful. For many students, hearing Pierre Curie lecture was unforgettable, not because of drama, but because of the sense that they were witnessing truth spoken without vanity. The Sorbonne position brought prestige, but also new burdens. Pierre was no longer free to work quietly in obscurity. He was expected to represent his field, guide young scientists, and fulfill public duties. At the same time, demands for his presence grew. Invitations from abroad, interviews, ceremonies, and honors. He accepted some reluctantly, but always with discomfort. He often confessed to friends that he found such duties draining. What he desired most, long, quiet days in the laboratory with Marie, became harder to maintain. By this time, both Pierre and Marie were suffering from the effects of radiation exposure. Their hands bore chronic burns. They were frequently fatigued, plagued by weakness and aches. Their laboratory, without proper safety measures, had become a dangerous place. Pierre also suffered from exhaustion due to overwork. He taught, lectured, traveled, and conducted research, often with little rest. His thin frame and pale face revealed the toll. Yet he refused to slow down. To him, work was not a burden but a calling. Despite his frailty, Pierre continued to emphasize the potential dangers of radioactivity. In lectures and writings, he cautioned that radium, in the wrong hands, could cause harm. He imagined scenarios where its power might be misused for destruction. His warnings were largely ignored. The world was too entranced by the wonder of glowing radium to consider its risks. Industries began marketing radium products, from patent medicines to luminous paints, without caution. Pierre, with his quiet foresight, stood almost alone in urging responsibility. Even as recognition grew, Pierre remained indifferent to honors. He accepted them reluctantly, never boasting, never seeking more. When praised, he often looked embarrassed, as if the attention were misplaced. He believed science belonged not to individuals, but to humanity. He refused to patent radium extraction methods, insisting that discoveries should be free to all. His idealism was both noble and costly, leaving the Curies financially strained even as others profited. By 1906, Pierre Curie stood at the peak of his career. He was a Nobel laureate, a professor at the Sorbonne, and a respected voice in the international scientific community. He had achieved what few ever could, to open an entirely new field of science. Yet behind the honors, he was weary, overworked, and physically weakened. He carried the burden of responsibility with quiet strength, but the strain was evident. Fate, cruel and sudden, was about to intervene. The Sorbonne years were Pierre Curie's last chapter of professional triumph. He had finally achieved recognition, legitimacy, and respect, but they were also years of strain, fatigue, and fragility. He stood at the pinnacle of science, yet he was vulnerable. In the spring of 1906, tragedy would strike, cutting short a life of brilliance and humility. By 1905, Pierre Curie was only 46 years old, but his body told another story. Years of relentless work in harsh conditions had left him frail. His frame, always thin, now seemed gaunt. His hands bore chronic sores from handling radioactive substances. His skin showed burns that never fully healed. Fatigue haunted him. He suffered from fevers, unexplained pains, and episodes of weakness. He sometimes had difficulty walking long distances, his body struggling to keep pace with his restless mind. Neither he nor Marie fully understood the cause. At the time, the effects of radiation were not well studied. They attributed their illnesses to exhaustion and overwork rather than the invisible rays that silently poisoned them daily. Meanwhile, the weight of fame pressed heavily upon Pierre. The Nobel Prize had made him a public figure, but he remained profoundly uncomfortable with celebrity. He disliked banquets and ceremonies, often excusing himself from them. He found journalists intrusive, their questions superficial. He preferred silence to applause, truth to spectacle, yet he could not fully escape. As a Nobel laureate and professor at the Sorbonne, he was expected to represent French science with dignity. He traveled reluctantly to give lectures abroad, though each trip left him drained. Despite his fatigue, Pierre held on to one great dream, the creation of a research center dedicated to radioactivity. He envisioned a place where scientists could study the phenomenon with proper laboratories, safe facilities, and resources unavailable in their crude shed. He spoke of this Institute of Radium, often describing it as essential for the future of science and medicine. Though he would not live to see it, his dream would later be realized by Marie in 1914. Pierre also carried the responsibility of fatherhood. With Irene, born 1897, and Eve, born 1904, he was determined to be present despite his exhaustion. He walked with them, told them simple stories, and encouraged their curiosity. But balancing family, teaching, and research weighed heavily on him. Some days the strain showed in his face, the look of a man pulled in too many directions, refusing to complain, but quietly weary. In conversations with friends, Pierre sometimes confessed darker thoughts. The misuse of radium troubled him deeply. Industries were already marketing radium products, radium water, radium creams, radium tonics with reckless enthusiasm. He feared that their discovery, born in humility, could become corrupted by greed or even violence. He imagined scenarios where the immense energy within atoms might one day be used for destruction. These worries, combined with his failing health, gave him a somber air. In early 1906, Pierre was at once exhausted and restless. He continued teaching at the Sorbonne, supervising students and conducting research, but each task drained him more than before. Marie urged him to rest, but Pierre was not the kind of man to step away from unfinished work. Spring in Paris brought little relief. The city bustled with life, but Pierre seemed increasingly distant, his mind preoccupied, his body fragile. In April of that year, he walked the streets of Paris for the last time. By 1906, Pierre Curie was a man of paradox, world famous, yet weary of fame, brilliant yet physically weakened, celebrated yet haunted by doubts about the future of his discovery. He carried the weight of science, family, and responsibility on shoulders already bent with fatigue. And though no one could foresee it, his journey was about to end suddenly, not in illness, but in accident. On the 19th of April, 1906, Paris was soaked in a cold, steady rain. The streets were slick with mud, and horse-drawn carriages splashed through puddles. The city bustled with its usual noise, wheels clattering, horses snorting, vendors shouting, yet for Pierre Curie it would be the last day of his life. That afternoon he attended a meeting at the Faculty of Sciences. Tired, distracted, and weighed down by both work and fatigue, he walked through the crowded streets near the Pont Neuf. He carried no umbrella, his thin frame hunched against the rain. At around 2 p.m., Pierre stepped into the busy Rue Dauphine. A heavy horse-drawn wagon, loaded with military supplies, was approaching. Whether from distraction or poor visibility, Pierre misjudged the crossing. He slipped on the wet cobblestones, stumbled, and fell beneath the hooves of the horses. The massive wagon wheels passed over his head, killing him instantly. There was no time for help. The brilliant physicist, the husband, the father, was gone in an instant. News of Pierre Curie's death spread rapidly through Paris. Scientists, students, and ordinary citizens alike were stunned. How could such a great man, who had revealed the secrets of the atom, be lost in such a mundane accident? Marie Curie, devastated, received the news at home. The shock was unbearable. She later wrote of those days in her diary with simple, heartbreaking words. "Pierre is gone. He has left me, and I am alone." Her grief was compounded by the sheer suddenness of it. He had not died of illness or age, but in the randomness of a rainy street. Pierre Curie's funeral was held quietly, in keeping with his wishes for a simple life. He was buried in Sceaux, a small town south of Paris, where the Curie family had ties. There were no grand ceremonies, no state funerals, no pomp. Just colleagues, friends, and family, mourning a man whose humility in life was reflected in death. Marie stood stoically, though her heart was shattered. Their daughters, Irene, aged 9, and Eve, aged 2, were too young to fully understand, but their lives, too, were changed forever. Scientists across Europe mourned the loss. Tributes poured in. Lord Kelvin called Pierre's death a tragedy for science. Jean Perrin, a French physicist, said, "His work has opened a path for generations yet to come." Newspapers described him as a man of genius, modest to the end. Yet many also noted the bitter irony. Pierre Curie had survived years of dangerous work with radiation, only to be killed in a traffic accident. For Marie, Pierre's death was more than personal devastation. It was the loss of her collaborator, her confidant, her intellectual equal. Yet even in her grief, she made a decision. She would continue their work alone. Just a few weeks later, she returned to the laboratory. She took over Pierre's professorship at the Sorbonne, becoming the first woman to teach there. Standing before crowded lecture halls, she began with trembling hands, but soon found her voice. It was her way of keeping Pierre alive, by ensuring their shared dream of science did not die with him. Pierre Curie's death was sudden, brutal, and deeply unjust. A man who had devoted his life to truth and humility was struck down by chance on a rainy Parisian street. He was only 46 years old, and yet, though his life ended, his legacy did not. Through Marie, through their daughters, through the science he helped create, Pierre Curie lived on. When Pierre Curie died on the 19th of April, 1906, Marie's world collapsed. For 12 years, they had lived as partners in every sense, husband and wife, colleagues, co-discoverers, and intellectual equals. Their bond had been one of rare balance, built on respect, humility, and shared purpose. Now, in a single instant, on a rainy street, that bond was severed. Marie later confessed in her private notebooks that she felt as though she herself had died alongside Pierre. The world outside continued, but for her, life had been stripped of meaning. She wrote, "My Pierre, the anguish I feel at the thought of never seeing him again, never hearing his voice, never sharing our life, this anguish will never leave me." Marie was left with 2 daughters, Irene, only 9, and Eve, just 2 years old. She faced the crushing dual burden of grief and responsibility. Friends urged her to rest, to retreat from science, to focus on her family, but Marie rejected such advice. To her, abandoning their work would be the true betrayal of Pierre's memory. Instead, she resolved to continue both roles as mother and as scientist, with the same discipline and perseverance that had defined her entire life. Within weeks of Pierre's death, Marie returned to their laboratory. Many expected her to falter, unable to face the memories of their shared space. Instead, she immersed herself in the very work they had begun together. Every vial of radium, every notebook filled with calculations, every instrument designed by Pierre became sacred relics. To work was to feel him near. To measure radioactivity was to hear his voice in her mind. The shed that had been their sanctuary became her temple of mourning and perseverance. In May 1906, the Sorbonne faced a decision. Pierre Curie's professorship was vacant. Tradition dictated that a man should succeed him. Yet Marie, with her extraordinary achievements, was the only true heir to his work. In a groundbreaking decision, the Sorbonne appointed Marie Curie as Pierre's successor. She thus became the first woman professor in the history of the university. On the 5th of November, 1906, Marie gave her inaugural lecture. The hall was filled beyond capacity. Colleagues, students, journalists, and curious citizens crowded to witness history. She began, not with mention of herself, but with Pierre. "It is with profound emotion that I take the place that was occupied by my husband. I cannot hope to succeed him as he deserves, but I shall continue as best I can the work we undertook together." Her voice trembled at first, but soon steadied. By the end, she had captivated the audience. She had transformed her grief into resolve. In the years that followed, Marie threw herself into research. She worked to further isolate radium, refine methods of measurement, and expand the study of radioactivity. Each discovery, each lecture, each publication carried Pierre's name as much as her own. She often spoke of him to her daughters, ensuring that his memory lived not only in science, but in family. Irene, in particular, absorbed this legacy deeply, later pursuing physics herself, and eventually winning her own Nobel Prize with her husband, Frédéric Joliot. Marie never fully recovered from Pierre's death. She lived the rest of her life with his absence as a constant shadow. She rarely spoke of personal feelings publicly, but her private writings reveal enduring sorrow. And yet this sorrow became a source of strength. It sharpened her focus, steeled her will, and gave her purpose. She would honor Pierre not by retreating, but by pushing forward into the unknown, carrying their shared dream into the future. Between 1906 and 1910, Marie's fame grew even greater, but she carried it with dignity, never allowing herself to forget the man who had made everything possible. To the world, she was the widow who had stepped into her husband's shoes and triumphed. To herself, she was simply continuing the path they had chosen together. Pierre Curie's death could have ended their story. Instead, through Marie's determination, it became a beginning of another chapter. She transformed unbearable grief into unyielding perseverance. She ensured that Pierre's name was not erased, that their discoveries were not diminished, and that their daughters inherited both love and legacy. In carrying on, Marie gave Pierre Curie something rare: life beyond death, not only in memory, but in science itself. In the final years of his life, Pierre often spoke of a dream that consumed him, the creation of a research institute dedicated to radioactivity. He imagined a place where scientists could work in proper conditions, no longer confined to the drafty shed that had served as the birthplace of radium. The institute would have laboratories, lecture halls, and medical facilities to explore both the science and the therapeutic applications of radioactivity. Pierre believed this was not just a luxury, but a necessity. Radium, he warned, was too important and too dangerous to be studied without adequate facilities. Though he did not live to see it, his dream became Marie's mission. After Pierre's death in 1906, Marie threw herself into making his vision a reality. She recognized that the future of radioactivity required institutional support, a space where new generations of scientists could study, experiment, and collaborate. Her persistence, combined with growing international recognition, gradually attracted attention from philanthropists and governments. She began lobbying tirelessly for support, often reminding potential donors that such an institute had been Pierre's dream. The French government, still eager to celebrate the Curies as national treasures, eventually pledged support. Private donors contributed as well, inspired by Marie's determination and Pierre's legacy. One of the most important backers was the Rockefeller Foundation in the United States, which later provided significant funding. Their support demonstrated how far the influence of the Curie's work had spread across the Atlantic and around the world. In 1914, construction of the Radium Institute, Institut du Radium, in Paris was completed. It consisted of two main laboratories. The Curie Laboratory, dedicated to the physics and chemistry of radioactivity. The Pasteur Laboratory, focused on medical applications, especially cancer treatment. For Marie, the opening of the institute was bittersweet. It was the realization of Pierre's vision, yet he was not there to see it. She often spoke of the institute not as her own achievement, but as the fulfillment of Pierre's dream. The Radium Institute quickly became a global center for research. Scientists from around the world traveled to Paris to study under Marie and her colleagues. The institute advanced both fundamental science and practical medicine. For Pierre, had he lived, it would have been the perfect realization of his philosophy. Science pursued not for profit or spectacle, but for the advancement of humanity. The institute also became part of the Curie family's legacy. Pierre Curie, growing into a gifted scientist in her own right, would one day work there alongside her husband Frédéric Joliot, continuing the work begun by Pierre and Marie. In this sense, the Radium Institute was not only a monument to Pierre's dream, but also a bridge to the future of his family and their continued contributions to science. The Radium Institute was Pierre Curie's final dream, brought to life after his death by Marie's determination and the support of the scientific community. Though he never walked its halls, every brick carried his vision, every laboratory echoed his philosophy, and every experiment conducted there bore his silent presence. Pierre Curie had left the world too soon, but through the Radium Institute, his work lived on inspiring discoveries in both physics and medicine that would transform the 20th century. Pierre Curie died at just 46 years old, yet his contributions spanned multiple fields and laid foundations that still shape science today. His work was not a single discovery, but a series of profound insights into the hidden laws of nature. Each field he touched, crystallography, magnetism, radioactivity, bears his mark. Pierre's work on magnetism remains among his greatest achievements. Curie law. He demonstrated that the magnetization of paramagnetic materials is inversely proportional to their absolute temperature. This law is still taught in physics courses worldwide. Curie point, Curie temperature. He discovered that ferromagnetic materials lose their permanent magnetism above a critical temperature. This concept is central not only in physics, but also in geology, where it is used to study Earth's magnetic history, and in engineering, essential for materials science. Even today, scientists refer to the Curie temperature as a fundamental property of magnetic materials. Together with his brother Jacques, Pierre discovered piezoelectricity in 1880, the generation of electric charge when crystals are compressed. At the time, it seemed a scientific curiosity, but in the 20th and 21st centuries, it became indispensable. Sonar and ultrasound technologies rely on piezoelectric crystals. Quartz watches keep time with astonishing accuracy thanks to piezoelectric oscillators. Microphones, sensors, and lighter ignitions all employ piezoelectric effects. Pierre's insight into the deep connection between symmetry and physical properties paved the way for this revolution. Alongside Marie, Pierre helped uncover the phenomenon of radioactivity, a discovery that shattered the ancient idea of the atom as indivisible. Their isolation of polonium and radium revealed that atoms could transform, decay, and release immense energy. This opened the path to modern nuclear physics and chemistry. While Pierre did not live to see the nuclear age, his early warnings about the misuse of radium proved prophetic. He foresaw that atomic energy could bring both cures and catastrophes. Pierre and Marie also observed that radium could damage living tissue. While this was dangerous, it also offered promise for treating cancer. Physicians began experimenting with radium therapy in the early 1902, guided by the Curie's work. This was the birth of radiotherapy, which remains a cornerstone of modern cancer treatment. Today, millions of lives have been extended or saved through radiation therapy, a legacy that traces back to the Curie's discoveries. Perhaps less famous but equally profound was Pierre's principle of symmetry. The symmetry of causes must be found in the effects. This elegant idea influenced not only crystallography, but also 20th century physics, including relativity and quantum mechanics. It remains a guiding principle for scientists seeking hidden order in the universe. Despite his immense contributions, Pierre Curie has often been overshadowed by Marie in popular memory. Marie's extraordinary story as a pioneering woman in science, combined with her double Nobel Prizes, placed her in the spotlight of history. Yet within the scientific community, Pierre is remembered as a quiet genius, a man whose precision, humility, and originality reshaped physics. His name endures not only in awards and institutions, but in the very language of science: Curie law, Curie point, Curie constant, and the unit of radioactivity, the Curie, CI. Pierre Curie's legacy is immense, a body of work that spans from the tiniest crystal to the deepest laws of magnetism, from the atom's hidden power to the treatment of human disease. He was not a man of spectacle, but of truth. His discoveries were not accidents, but the product of patience, humility, and relentless precision. Though his life was short, his influence was vast. The world still moves to rhythms he uncovered: the ticking of quartz watches, the hum of medical imaging, the strength of materials, and the enduring search for symmetry in nature. Pierre Curie's story is not only of a life lived, but of a legacy still alive. From the beginning of his work with radium, Pierre Curie recognized both its promise and its peril. While the world celebrated radium as a miracle element, he saw it more soberly, a force of nature capable of healing and of harm. He once remarked in a lecture, "One must not forget that science is made for humanity, but it can also be misused, and when that happens, it may cause more harm than good." This balance between wonder and warning lay at the heart of Pierre's scientific philosophy. At a time when most of his peers marveled at radium's glow, Pierre was already cautioning that in criminal hands it could become a weapon. His foresight, decades before nuclear weapons, was extraordinary. He understood what many refused to see, that knowledge itself is neutral, but its application depends on human choice. This insight foreshadowed the dilemmas of the 20th century, when nuclear science would bring both the horrors of Hiroshima and the hope of nuclear medicine. Pierre also bore personally the cost of discovery. He and Marie handled radioactive materials without protection, breathing dust, carrying vials in their pockets, storing glowing samples in their desk drawers. Their bodies paid the price: burns, chronic fatigue, mysterious illnesses. Pierre's early death, though caused by accident, was shadowed by years of exposure that weakened him. Marie herself would later succumb to radiation-induced illness. The lesson is clear. Progress in science often comes at great personal sacrifice. Behind every law or discovery lies the labor, suffering, and sometimes the lives of those who pursued truth without regard for safety. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Pierre did not revel in recognition. Fame embarrassed him, wealth meant little to him, and power never interested him. He refused to patent radium extraction, insisting that discoveries belonged to humanity, not to individuals. This humility, while noble, left his family financially vulnerable, even as industries profited from his discoveries. Yet it also secured his moral integrity. Pierre Curie never sold science for personal gain. Pierre Curie's life offers profound lessons for scientists, thinkers, and dreamers today. Truth over glory. He pursued knowledge for its own sake, not for wealth or fame. Partnership and equality. He treated Marie as an equal partner, supporting her career in a world hostile to women. Ethical foresight. He warned of dangers long before others, reminding us that science is not only about what can be done, but also what should be done. Human sacrifice. His life and health remind us that progress is often paid for by individuals willing to risk everything for discovery. Legacy of symmetry. His philosophy teaches that nature's beauty lies in balance, order, and hidden laws waiting to be revealed. Pierre Curie's reflections on science and ethics resonate powerfully in our own time. His warnings about misuse, his humility in fame, and his acceptance of sacrifice remind us that science is not separate from morality, it is bound to it. Though his life was cut short, the questions he raised remain alive. What responsibilities do scientists bear? How should humanity wield the powers it uncovers? Can discovery be separated from its consequences? Pierre Curie left no simple answers, only the conviction that truth must be sought with humility, courage, and conscience. Pierre Curie's untimely death in 1906 left behind not only a grieving widow, but also 2 young daughters, Irene, aged 9, and Eve, just 2 years old. Each girl would carry forward a different part of their father's legacy. Irene would inherit Pierre's scientific spirit, following her parents into the laboratory and one day winning her own Nobel Prize. Eve would inherit Pierre's humanity and sensitivity, choosing a life of writing, music, and humanitarian service. Together, they embodied the 2 sides of Pierre Curie, the relentless seeker of truth and the quiet man of love and conscience. Irene Curie grew up steeped in science. From childhood, she watched her parents handle strange glowing substances, listened to their conversations about atoms and energy, and absorbed the atmosphere of the laboratory. Marie ensured that Irene received rigorous education, but also instilled in her the same independence Pierre had valued. Irene proved brilliant, methodical, and determined. As an adult, she worked closely with her mother at the Radium Institute. There she met and later married Frédéric Joliot, another gifted physicist. Together, they became a scientific powerhouse, much like Pierre and Marie. In 1934, Irene and Frédéric Joliot-Curie discovered artificial radioactivity, proving that stable elements could be made radioactive by bombarding them with particles. This breakthrough had enormous implications for both medicine and nuclear physics. For this achievement, Irene and Frédéric received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1935. In that moment, Pierre's legacy lived again. His daughter, like her parents, had reached the pinnacle of science. Eve Curie, born in 1904, was only 2 years old when Pierre died. Unlike her sister, she did not pursue science. Instead, she developed talents in literature, music, and humanitarian work. Eve studied piano and became a gifted musician. She also became a writer, using words to capture stories and emotions in ways her parents had not. Her most famous work was Madame Curie, 1937, a biography of her mother. The book became an international bestseller, translated into many languages, and even adapted into a Hollywood film. Through this biography, Eve preserved not only Marie's story, but also Pierre's, portraying him as the gentle, modest genius who had shaped their family's destiny. During World War II, Eve worked with the Allied forces as a journalist and humanitarian. She later became active with UNICEF, devoting her life to children's welfare. In this way, she carried forward Pierre's humanity, compassion, and belief in serving others. Though Irene and Eve chose different lives, they reflected the two sides of their father. Irene carried Pierre's scientific precision and intellectual rigor. Eve carried Pierre's moral conscience and humility. Both daughters ensured that his memory did not fade. Through science and through words, through discovery and through service, they gave Pierre Curie a legacy that reached beyond his own lifetime. The Curies became the most extraordinary family in the history of the Nobel Prize. Pierre and Marie shared the Nobel Prize in Physics, 1903. Marie won a second Nobel Prize in Chemistry, 1911. Irene and Frédéric Joliot-Curie won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, 1935. This made 3 Nobel Prizes in the direct Curie line, with others in extended collaborations. No other family has achieved such distinction. Pierre's dream of science as a shared endeavor, pursued in humility, passed from one generation to the next, was fulfilled through his children and grandchildren. Pierre Curie's life ended suddenly, but his influence continued through his daughters. Irene carried his brilliance into physics and chemistry, ensuring the Curie name remained at the forefront of science. Eve carried his humanity into literature and humanitarian work, ensuring that the world remembered not just the scientist, but the man. Together, they wove a legacy that honored their father in every dimension: intellect and heart, discovery and service. Pierre and Marie Curie were, in truth, inseparable in their work. Their greatest discoveries, radioactivity, polonium, radium, were born of their joint efforts. Their marriage was not only romantic but profoundly intellectual, one of the rare true partnerships in the history of science. Yet history, with its tendency to simplify, has often remembered them unequally. Marie Curie became a global icon. The first woman Nobel laureate, the only person to win 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences, and a symbol of female perseverance. Pierre, despite his equal role, is often remembered only as Marie Curie's husband. Several reasons explain why Marie's fame eclipsed Pierre's in popular imagination. Longevity. Pierre died tragically young at 46. Marie lived until 1934, carrying the Curie legacy forward for nearly 3 decades after his death. Trailblazing woman. As a woman in science, Marie's achievements broke barriers, attracting enormous attention. Her story resonated with movements for gender equality. Double Nobel laureate. Marie's unprecedented second Nobel Prize in 1911 ensured her place as a singular figure in history. Public presence. Pierre shunned publicity, avoided interviews, and disliked ceremonies. Marie, though equally modest, accepted recognition when necessary and became the face of their discoveries. But those who knew Pierre never doubted his genius. Colleagues described him as a man of extraordinary precision and insight, capable of building instruments more sensitive than any of his peers, and of drawing profound conclusions from modest experiments. His Curie law and Curie point remain cornerstones of physics. His discovery of piezoelectricity with Jacques continues to power technologies we use daily. His warnings about the misuse of radium revealed foresight rare among scientists of his time. In his quiet way, Pierre was as much a revolutionary as Marie. Pierre and Marie's personalities also influenced how they were remembered. Pierre, shy, introverted, almost ascetic. He disliked honors, rejected wealth, and found joy only in science and family. He once remarked that the Nobel Prize embarrassed him. Marie, equally modest but more pragmatic. She recognized that honors could open doors, funding for laboratories, opportunities for students, legitimacy for women in science. Thus, history embraced Marie as a symbol, while Pierre receded into the background. The tendency to celebrate Marie while minimizing Pierre does injustice to both. It distorts their story, suggesting one carried the other, when in fact they carried each other. Their discoveries were born of dialogue, trust, and collaboration. Pierre's instruments made Marie's measurements possible. Marie's determination drove their endless separations of oars. Together, they achieved what neither could alone. Their story is not of Marie Curie alone, nor of Pierre Curie alone, but of Pierre and Marie Curie together. In recent years, historians have sought to restore balance. Pierre is increasingly recognized as more than Marie's husband, as a pioneer in his own right, whose early work on magnetism and symmetry influenced generations of physicists. His name endures in units of radioactivity, in scientific laws, and in the institutions founded on his dream. But perhaps the greatest restoration comes in remembering the human Pierre, devoted husband, loving father, humble thinker. In the shadows and light of memory, Marie Curie shines brightest. Yet beside her, sometimes hidden, sometimes forgotten, stands Pierre, equal in brilliance, unmatched in humility, and essential to their shared triumphs. Their story is not one of competition, but of partnership. To honor Marie fully is also to honor Pierre, for without him there would have been no Curie legacy as we know it. Pierre Curie never saw science as detached from humanity. For him, scientific discovery was not just about knowledge, but about its consequences. He believed that scientists bore responsibility for how their work might be used. This attitude set him apart. Many of his contemporaries pursued discovery without much thought for its ethical implications. Pierre, by contrast, was always aware that science was a double-edged sword. Radium, the element Pierre and Marie had painstakingly isolated, symbolized both hope and danger. Hope. Doctors began to see its potential for treating cancer. Patients found relief when tumors shrank under radium therapy. It offered the possibility of medicine more precise than anything before. Danger. Its rays burned skin, caused sores, and exhausted those exposed. Even without full understanding, Pierre realized that long-term effects might be severe. He was fascinated by radium's mysterious glow, but also troubled. To him, it seemed like fire, life-giving when controlled, devastating when misused. In his Nobel lecture of 1903, Pierre made a striking remark. One can conceive that in criminal hands, radium might prove to be very dangerous, and one is to be feared that it might one day serve to make men suffer. At the time, his words seemed abstract. Decades later, with the development of nuclear weapons, they would appear prophetic. Pierre did not live to see Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but he sensed the direction that science might take. Pierre's reflection raised timeless questions. Should scientists pursue knowledge regardless of its potential consequences? Do they have a moral obligation to prevent misuse of their discoveries? Can science ever be separated from ethics? Pierre's own answer was clear. Responsibility cannot be ignored. He believed science should serve humanity, not endanger it. Pierre's own life embodied the human cost of discovery. He and Marie worked without protective measures, unaware of the dangers of radiation. Their bodies bore the scars, burns, fatigue, chronic illnesses. He died not from radiation, but from accident. Yet his weakened health reflected years of exposure. Marie herself would later succumb to radiation-induced illness. Their sacrifices remind us that progress is often built on the risks borne by pioneers. Despite the dangers, Pierre remained convinced that science could uplift humanity if guided by conscience. He dreamed of a research institute not for profit, but for knowledge and healing. He refused patents, believing discoveries must remain free for the world. His idealism was rare and costly. The Curies struggled financially, even as industries profited from radium. Yet Pierre's integrity endured. He valued truth above wealth, conscience above recognition. Pierre Curie's ethical reflections stand as a warning and a guide. He saw clearly that science is never neutral. It can heal or destroy, liberate or oppress. His life challenges us to ask not only what can we discover, but also what should we do with discovery. Though history often forgets his words, they remain vital today in an age of nuclear weapons, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence. Pierre Curie reminds us that science without conscience is peril, and science with conscience is hope. Pierre Curie was, above all, a man of modesty and simplicity. Unlike many of his contemporaries who pursued honors, titles, or wealth, Pierre cared little for material possessions. His apartment was sparsely furnished, his clothes were plain, and his meals were modest. To him, comfort and luxury were distractions. What mattered was truth, knowledge, and the quiet joy of discovery. His humility bordered on asceticism, a deliberate rejection of vanity in favor of purpose. Pierre's discomfort with fame is well documented. When he and Marie received the Nobel Prize in 1903, he accepted it only reluctantly. To a friend, he confessed that the prize embarrassed him. He disliked ceremonies, interviews, and speeches. When praised, he often looked uneasy, even irritated. He believed science was not about personal recognition, but about service to humanity. This indifference was not arrogance, but conviction. He felt honors distorted the essence of scientific work, which was to seek truth, not applause. Pierre's colleagues admired him for his rigorous honesty. He never exaggerated results, never claimed more than he could prove, and never sought shortcuts. He was patient, precise, and cautious, often repeating experiments many times before publishing. His reputation for accuracy was so great that when the Curies announced new elements, many accepted it simply because Pierre's name was attached. He believed errors were not shameful as long as they were admitted openly. What mattered was integrity. Behind his quiet demeanor, Pierre was a devoted and gentle husband. From the start, he treated Marie not as a subordinate, but as an equal, a radical stance in an era when women in science were often dismissed or excluded. He encouraged her ambitions, defended her recognition, and supported her career even when others doubted. His love was expressed less in words than in actions, walking with her, cycling on their honeymoon, standing by her side in the laboratory, carrying the burdens of parenthood when needed. Pierre's love extended to his daughters, Irene and Eve. He was not an outwardly playful man, but he showed affection through presence. He carried Irene on his shoulders through Paris streets, built simple toys, and answered her endless questions with patience. He encouraged curiosity in both daughters, modeling a life where truth and learning were cherished. For Irene, especially, his example would shape her path into science. Socially, Pierre was reserved, even awkward. He disliked small talk, found social gatherings tedious, and often seemed lost in thought. Some mistook this for coldness, but those close to him saw it differently. He was simply a man absorbed in the deeper rhythms of life. He found meaning not in crowds, but in quiet conversations, in the pages of scientific journals, and in the silent glow of radium in a darkened room. Perhaps most striking was Pierre's moral integrity. He refused patents on radium, insisting discoveries must remain free. He turned down positions and honors that conflicted with his values. He worried about the misuse of science when others celebrated only its triumphs. His conscience guided not only his research, but his life choices: simplicity over wealth, humility over vanity, truth over convenience. Pierre Curie's character was as remarkable as his discoveries. He was a man who combined brilliance with humility, love with discipline, and conscience with courage. He showed that greatness does not require arrogance, that science can be pursued without greed, and that the measure of a life is not in wealth or honors, but in truth and love. Pierre Curie, the scientist, changed physics. Pierre Curie, the man, offered a model of integrity that still inspires. Among fellow scientists, Pierre Curie was regarded as a man of extraordinary precision and honesty. His colleagues trusted his data almost without question, for they knew he would never publish an unverified result. Jean Perrin, a French physicist who later won the Nobel Prize, recalled Pierre as a man whose quiet words carried more weight than the speeches of others. Lord Kelvin, one of the giants of 19th century physics, praised Pierre's clarity and rigor, calling him a true physicist in the highest sense. Scientists valued not only his discoveries, the Curie law, the Curie point, piezoelectricity, and radioactivity, but also his method: cautious, meticulous, never sensational. When Pierre became a professor at the Sorbonne in 1904, students flocked to his lectures. For many, hearing him was a formative experience. He was not a charismatic orator. His voice was soft, his delivery plain. Some students even struggled to hear him in the crowded lecture halls. Yet those who listened closely found his words profound. He explained complex concepts with a simplicity that revealed their essence. Students often described him as a teacher who demanded thought rather than memorization. He encouraged them to question, to test, to seek underlying principles rather than accept authority blindly. For many young scientists, Pierre became a model not just of intellect but of integrity. Journalists who attempted to interview Pierre found him difficult, even frustrating. He disliked publicity, gave short answers, and often appeared distracted, as though his mind were elsewhere. When asked about the miracle of radium, Pierre responded soberly, pointing out its dangers as well as its promise. Reporters hoping for dramatic statements often left disappointed. The public, however, admired him. His modesty, his refusal to seek wealth, and his devotion to science gave him an aura of purity in an age when many intellectuals sought fame. He became, somewhat unwillingly, a symbol of honest science. Friends saw a gentler side of Pierre. He enjoyed long walks in nature, often with Marie or his daughters. He preferred small gatherings with close companions to grand banquets. He was capable of quiet humor, though rarely in public. Those closest to him described him as a man of deep kindness and loyalty. He never raised his voice, rarely showed anger, and treated everyone from colleagues to students to workers with respect. Marie, in particular, saw in him not only a partner in science, but a companion of rare gentleness. After his death, she would often describe him as the most honest and humble man she had ever known. Yet Pierre's modesty sometimes led to misunderstanding. Some mistook his silence for arrogance. Others thought his indifference to honors meant he lacked ambition. In truth, Pierre was ambitious, but not for himself. His ambition was for truth, for science, for humanity. He sought no personal glory, but he sought endlessly for knowledge. To his contemporaries, Pierre Curie was many things. To colleagues, a scientist of unmatched rigor. To students, a quiet but inspiring teacher. To journalists, an elusive figure. To friends, a kind and loyal companion. To Marie and his daughters, a devoted husband and father. He was admired, respected, sometimes misunderstood, but never forgotten by those who truly knew him. Pierre Curie's image in his own time was one of a man who embodied both genius and humility, a rare combination in any age. Pierre Curie's discoveries were not isolated triumphs. They were seeds planted in fertile ground, growing into entire fields of research. His laws, principles, and methods echoed through the 20th century, guiding scientists who built upon his foundation. Even though he died in 1906, before Einstein published his theories of relativity, before Rutherford split the atom, Before quantum mechanics revolutionized physics, Pierre's fingerprints are everywhere in these developments. Pierre's Curie law and Curie point became cornerstones of solid-state physics. His insights into how temperature affects magnetism guided research into the behavior of materials at the atomic level. Later, scientists used his principles to develop magnetic storage device, understand superconductivity and ferromagnetism, explore the role of magnetism in geology and planetary science. Even in today's cutting-edge research, from computer chips to spintronics, Pierre's work on magnetism remains fundamental. Pierre's principle of symmetry had a profound philosophical influence. He insisted that the symmetry of causes must be reflected in their effects. This simple but powerful idea guided generations of physicists searching for the underlying laws of nature. In the 20th century, symmetry became a central theme in particle physics. Theories of fundamental forces, including the Standard Model, are built on principles of symmetry. From Einstein's relativity to quantum field theory, the echoes of Pierre's insight resound. Together with Marie, Pierre helped reveal that atoms were not indivisible, but dynamic and unstable. This revelation was the starting point for nuclear physics. Their work on radium and polonium paved the way for Rutherford's nuclear model of the atom, the discovery of nuclear fission in the 1932nd, the development of nuclear power and, tragically, nuclear weapons. Though Pierre did not live to see it, his research was a crucial stepping stone in unlocking the atom's energy. Pierre and Marie's observation that radium could damage tissues led directly to the birth of radiotherapy. What began as crude experiments with radioactive salts became one of the most powerful tools in modern oncology. Today, radiation therapy is used to treat millions of cancer patients worldwide. In every hospital that employs radiotherapy, Pierre's legacy is present. Few would have guessed that Pierre's curiosity about crystals would one day shape daily life. His discovery of piezoelectricity with Jacques led to microphones and loudspeakers, quartz watches, ultrasound machines, sensors and electronic components. Each time someone checks the time on a quartz watch or undergoes an ultrasound, they unknowingly benefit from Pierre's early insight. Pierre's legacy also lived on in his family. His daughter, Irene Joliet Curie, and her husband, Frederick, carried forward the torch, discovering artificial radioactivity and winning a Nobel Prize in 1935. Beyond family, generations of physicists and chemists studied in the laboratories that bore his name, inspired by his integrity and vision. Even in the 21st century, Pierre Curie's values matter. Precision. In an age of vast data, his insistence on accuracy reminds us that truth depends on careful measurement. Humility. In a world of fame and ambition, his indifference to honors reminds us that science must serve humanity, not ego. Ethics. In an era of nuclear weapons and genetic engineering, his warnings about misuse are more relevant than ever. Pierre Curie belongs not only to history, but to the present, a guidepost for how science should be pursued. Pierre Curie did not live to see the nuclear age, quantum mechanics, or the digital revolution, yet his discoveries and principles laid the groundwork for them all. From the ticking of quartz watches to the treatment of cancer, from theories of symmetry in particle physics to the study of Earth's magnetism, his influence is everywhere. The future of science is still written in the language he helped invent. Though Pierre Curie lived modestly and shunned honors, his memory has been preserved in tangible ways. In Paris, several streets and schools bear the Curie name. The Pierre and Marie Curie University, Université Pierre et Marie Curie, later merged into Sorbonne University, was named in their honor, symbolizing their lasting impact on French science. Statues and plaques commemorate the Curies across France, Poland, and beyond. Unlike some historical figures, Pierre's memorials are understated, often emphasizing not grandeur but humility fitting for a man who lived quietly. In 1995, almost 90 years after his death, Pierre Curie and Marie Curie were reinterred in the Panthéon in Paris, the resting place of France's greatest figures. This was a historic event. Marie became the first woman to be honored in the Pantheon for her own achievements, and Pierre joined her in recognition of their shared legacy. Their tomb, simple yet dignified, stands as a reminder of two lives joined in love, science, and sacrifice. Pierre has been immortalized in biographies, often alongside Marie, but also in works devoted to him. His daughters, especially Eve Curie, played a crucial role in preserving his memory. Eve's biography, Madame Curie, 1937, focused primarily on her mother, but it also portrayed Pierre with tenderness as the quiet, gentle genius whose love and collaboration made the Curie story possible. Historians of science have since worked to restore Pierre's place, ensuring he is not overshadowed by Marie's extraordinary fame. In popular culture, Pierre Curie has often appeared as a supporting character in portrayals of Marie. Films such as Madame Curie, 1943, and later adaptations highlight his role, though sometimes simplifying his personality into that of the supportive husband. Recent efforts in documentaries and historical works have sought to correct this, showing Pierre not merely as Marie's partner, but as a pioneer in his own right, the man who discovered piezoelectricity, the Curie law, and the Curie point long before radium entered their lives. Perhaps Pierre's most enduring memorial lies in the language of science itself. The unit of radioactivity, the Curie, CI, was named in honor of Pierre and Marie. The Curie point and Curie law remain standard terms in physics. The Curie principle of symmetry continues to inspire scientists in multiple disciplines. Every time a physicist or chemist invokes his name, Pierre Curie lives on not as a statue or symbol, but as a working part of science. In an age when many scientists sought fame, Pierre became a cultural symbol of humility. To admirers, he represented the ideal of the scientist as a servant of truth, not ego. This cultural image, the quiet, modest genius, has shaped how later generations view not only Pierre, but science itself. He stands as a reminder that greatness does not require arrogance, and that discovery can be pursued with dignity. Pierre Curie's memory endures in stone, in words, in film, and above all in the scientific language of our daily lives. From the Pantheon to the physics classroom, from biographies to laboratories, his name carries weight. Though often overshadowed by Marie in public imagination, Pierre's cultural legacy remains that of the humble genius, the man who pursued truth for its own sake and gave his life to science. His greatest memorial, however, is not built of marble or bronze, but of the countless technologies, treatments, and theories that still bear his name. Few families in history have carried such a scientific legacy as the Curies. What began with Pierre and Marie's partnership blossomed into a dynasty of knowledge, achievement, and service. Pierre and Marie Curie, discoverers of radioactivity, winners of the 1,903 Nobel Prize in Physics. Marie Curie alone, winner of the 1,911 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for isolating radium and polonium. Irène Joliot-Curie, daughter, and Frédéric Joliot-Curie, son-in-law, winners of the 1,935 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for discovering artificial radioactivity. Eve Curie, daughter, not a scientist but a writer, journalist, and humanitarian who carried the Curie name into literature and global service. No other family has matched this combination of scientific triumph and cultural influence. Though Marie's fame grew larger, Pierre's influence remained woven through the family. His humility, his devotion to truth, and his refusal to compromise on ethics shaped how the Curies approached science. Marie often invoked Pierre's memory in her work, presenting their discoveries as shared achievements. Irene and Frederick, in their laboratory at the Radium Institute, carried forward Pierre's vision of science as a collective endeavor, not a personal pursuit. Eve, in her writings and humanitarian missions, portrayed Pierre as a man of integrity, ensuring that the public never forgot the gentle, modest genius who had stood beside Marie. The Curie legacy was not only about physics and chemistry, it was also about service to humanity. During World War I, Marie and Irene organized mobile X-ray units known as Petites Curies to help doctors on the battlefield. These efforts saved countless lives, translating their scientific discoveries into immediate human good. Eve, decades later, worked with UNICEF, dedicating her life to children's welfare. In every act of service, one could trace Pierre's philosophy: science and knowledge must ultimately serve humanity. Pierre's warnings about the misuse of radium also became part of the Curie legacy. Later generations of scientists in the family echoed his caution, recognizing that discoveries could be twisted for destruction as well as healing. This ethical thread continues today in debates over nuclear energy, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence. Pierre's voice, though from another century, still speaks. Discovery demands conscience. Together, the Curie family became a cultural symbol, not just of genius, but of sacrifice, humility, and service. They represented science at its best: collaborative, ethical, and human-centered. At the heart of that symbol was Pierre, the man who lived simply, thought deeply, and died too soon, but whose influence shaped generations. The Curie dynasty remains one of the most extraordinary legacies in human history. Through Nobel Prizes, books, humanitarian missions, and medical breakthroughs, their influence spans far beyond laboratories. Pierre Curie's hand can be seen in all of it. Though his life was short, his values, humility, precision, conscience became the foundation not only of a family, but of a vision of science itself. His legacy endures not just in physics or chemistry, but in humanity's ongoing struggle to balance discovery with responsibility. Pierre Curie reached the pinnacle of scientific achievement, yet he remained deeply humble. He shunned fame, disliked ceremonies, and felt embarrassed by applause. His Nobel Prize, rather than a triumph to celebrate, was to him a distraction from the real work. Lesson: true greatness does not require recognition. Knowledge, pursued for its own sake and for humanity's good, is its own reward. Pierre's relationship with Marie Curie was revolutionary not just in science, but in gender equality. At a time when women were often excluded from academia, he insisted that Marie's name appear alongside his. He defended her right to recognition, even pressing the Nobel Committee to include her in 1903. Lesson: collaboration thrives on equality. Respecting and supporting partners in work, in love, in life multiplies strength and yields discoveries no one could achieve alone. Pierre and Marie refused to patent their methods of extracting radium. They believed knowledge should belong to all, not be monopolized for profit. This decision left them financially strained, even as industries profited from their work, but it preserved their integrity. Lesson: the true value of discovery lies in its service to humanity, not in personal enrichment. Knowledge should be shared, not hoarded. Pierre was among the first to warn of the dangers of radioactivity. Long before nuclear weapons existed, he imagined how radium, in the wrong hands, could be used for harm. He saw that science could be both healer and destroyer. Lesson: discovery without conscience is perilous. Every generation of scientists must ask not only what can be done, but what should be done. Pierre's own life bore the marks of sacrifice. His body weakened under years of radiation exposure. His sudden death was accidental, yet his health had long been eroded by the conditions of his work. He paid, with his life, the price of pushing science into unknown realms. Lesson: Progress often comes at personal cost. Behind every breakthrough lies the sacrifice of individuals willing to risk themselves for the advancement of humanity. Pierre believes science was not an ivory tower pursuit, but a service to humanity. From piezoelectricity, powering modern technology, to radioactivity, powering both medicine and energy, his discoveries touched the world beyond academia. Lesson: science achieves its highest purpose when it serves life, when it heals, enlightens, and uplifts humanity. Despite fame, Pierre lived simply. His home was modest, his meals plain, his possessions few. He found joy not in luxury, but in walking with Marie, carrying Irene on his shoulders, and working quietly in his laboratory. Lesson: a meaningful life does not require wealth or grandeur. True richness lies in purpose, love, and simplicity. Pierre's principle of symmetry and his work in magnetism showed his willingness to question assumptions and seek deeper truths. He never accepted knowledge passively. He asked what lay beneath appearances. Lesson: progress is born not from acceptance, but from questioning. To move forward, one must have the courage to ask, why? What if? Could it be different? Pierre Curie's life offers a constellation of lessons: humility, equality, conscience, sacrifice, simplicity, service, and the courage to question. He was not only a scientist of brilliance, but also a man of values, showing that knowledge divorced from ethics is dangerous, but knowledge guided by integrity can change the world. For modern scientists, leaders, and dreamers, his life is a compass pointing toward truth, responsibility, and humanity. Pierre Curie's death in 1906 was sudden, brutal, and deeply unjust. At just 46, he was at the peak of his powers, poised to deepen his discoveries and expand his influence. His dream of a proper institute for radioactivity remained unfinished in his lifetime. His daughters were still young, his family still needed him, and yet fate ended it all on a rain-slick street in Paris. We are left wondering, what more might Pierre have achieved if he had lived longer? Could he have guided science with his conscience through the turbulent decades that followed? Might he have altered the trajectory of the atomic age? These questions will forever remain unanswered. For Marie, Irene, and Eve, his death was not only a personal tragedy, but also a silence, the silence of a husband, father, and partner gone too soon. Marie bore that silence for the rest of her life, filling it with work, devotion, and determination, but never escaping its shadow. For science, too, his absence was a silence. His cautious voice, warning against misuse, might have tempered the reckless enthusiasm that sometimes followed radium's discovery. Even in absence, Pierre Curie's life speaks. He reminds us that science is fragile without conscience. He reminds us that humility, even in greatness, is possible. He reminds us that equality in partnership, whether in marriage or in research, is not only just, but fruitful. He reminds us that knowledge, shared freely, becomes humanity's inheritance, not a private possession. Pierre Curie's life leaves us with questions that resonate still. Can discovery exist without responsibility? Is humanity wise enough to handle the powers it unlocks? How can we balance ambition with humility, progress with caution, knowledge with ethics? These questions are not Pierre's alone. They are ours, the inheritance of every generation that builds upon the discoveries of those before. Pierre Curie's story does not end in 1906, nor in 1914 with the Radium Institute, nor in 1934 with Marie's death, nor even with Irene and Eve carrying forward his legacy. His story continues each time a scientist invokes his principles, each time a patient undergoes radiotherapy, each time a student learns about the Curie law or the Curie point. It continues whenever we ask, what is science for? Pierre Curie never sought to be remembered. Yet in his humility, he ensured remembrance of the highest kind, not in monuments or wealth, but in truths that endure, in lessons that matter, and in questions that refuse to die. Pierre Curie was not forgotten, though at times overshadowed. He was not loud, but his silence spoke volumes. He did not live long, but he lived with meaning. His open ending is our responsibility, to continue his search for truth, his insistence on conscience, his belief in equality, and his devotion to humanity. For though Pierre Curie is gone, his questions remain, and in seeking their answers, we keep his spirit alive.